Sohrab Ahmari, who's with us tonight, is an Iranian-American columnist, editor, and author of non-fiction books. He is currently the op-ed editor of the New York Post and a contributing editor of the Catholic Herald. Previously, he served as a columnist and editor with the Wall Street Journal opinion pages in New York and London, and as a senior writer at Commentary magazine. Ahmari co-edited the 2012 book Arab Spring Dreams, an anthology of essays by young Middle Eastern dissidents. Ahmari's book, The New Philistines, a polemic on how identity politics are corrupting the arts, was released in October 2016 from Biteback Publishing. In January 2019, Ignatius Press published his spiritual memoir, From Fire by Water, about his conversion to Roman Catholicism. The title of his talk tonight is, Does God Need Politics? Please join me in welcoming Sohrab Ahmari to Lafayette.
Well, thank you to Professor Van Dyke for inviting me, and the Mill series as well, and all of you for being here. I'm told that it's better to try to keep my talk as short as I can. Unfortunately, as you can see, I brought a quite thick pile of papers. I don't normally read. When I give talks, I just talk. But in this case, I wanted to give you a taste of a new book I'm working on, which poses 12 questions that I think our liberal modernity does not pose. And it's a personal book in the sense that I'm writing it for my son. I have a 2.5-year-old son. His name is Maximilian. And I'm worried about the creature that our civilization will chisel out of him. And so I want to transmit something to him. But the way I'm transmitting it is by posing difficult questions and then exploring each question through the life and thinking of one great thinker. I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a theologian, I'm a journalist and a popularizer. So that's the spirit of this book. I'm transmitting, I am not creating. I'm not coming up with new insights. But the process of transmitting itself has been quite exciting. Before I begin, just a couple of preliminary questions just so I can get a sense of the room. By raise of hand, how many of you had read the entirety of Augustine's Confessions? Okay. And how many have dipped into the City of God? Even not reading the whole, but dipped in. Okay, good. All right. That's good because, look, I mean, if I can give you a taste of Augustine, which is, I mean, his writing is just, and by the way, when I was received into the church, I took the name Augustine as my patron, so I feel a great devotion to him. So if I can give you a taste of his ideas, even if we disagree about other things, I think many of you may want to talk about contemporary politics, and I'm a journalist, and I have very sort of well-known views on things. I think we can get that in the Q&A. But maybe with the initial part, we can pull back a little bit and take a wider intellectual and philosophical horizon. So let me begin with a hard premise, which we can then explore in the question and answer session, namely that human dignity depends on some account of the divine origin and destiny of the human person. Put it another way, unless there's something special about human beings, then there's no reason to treat them as dignified and rights-bearing as our civilization tries to do. Again, we can explore that premise later, but if you accept it for now, for argument's sake, then it follows that a society that wants to fully honor human dignity must also honor the divine. Now, that is a crucial fork in the road that diverts liberal modernity from the great stream of traditional thought. The modern argument runs something like this. You may have encountered it either explicitly or not, certainly in a sort of osmosis, that since we can't agree on the highest end or the ultimate meaning of human existence, our political communities mustn't be devoted to matters of God or ultimate meaning. More crudely, religion and politics don't mix. Society as a whole can't honor the divine. Rather, the thinking goes, this is our society's premise, politics must be neutral ground on which citizens can vie over questions of secular public policy without God sticking his nose into how much taxes the wealthy pay, how we treat immigrants and refugees, how we organize healthcare, and so on. Spiritual concerns, thus, belong to a private sphere. Each citizen can hold fast to her own account of ultimate meaning, including, crucially, the belief that life has no meaning. Now, while overwhelmingly predominant today, this position would have been unintelligible to all the great traditions of the West. Neither the Jewish and Christian nor the Greco-Roman traditions made such a sharp distinction between religion on the one hand and politics on the other. But nowadays, even many Christians think that such a cleavage is not only possible, but even desirable. After all, didn't the poor Jew, Jesus of Nazareth, instruct his followers to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God that are the things that are God's? As he was about to be executed, didn't he tell Pilate, "My kingship is not of this world"? Wouldn't the kingdom of heaven be tainted if it were to be commingled with earthly kingdoms? What need had God of Caesar's sword? In short, and this is our question for the evening, does God need politics? And to explore it, I propose we take a journey back to antiquity, and specifically to the late Roman Empire. The year is 410 AD, it's the autumn, and Africa's Mediterranean shore is witness to a sorry sight. Thousands of men and women of every social class, nobles and their servants, lawmakers, priests, artisans, others, disembarking vessels that had just carried them across the water from Italy. The young ones trembled about what the future might hold, while the elderly were just too dazed to worry, for their whole world had simply collapsed in a short span. The horrors that they had endured still seemed to flicker in the eyes of these new arrivals. They were escapees from the barbarian invasion of Rome. On August 24th, 410, Alaric, the Visigoth chieftain, broke through the last defensive barriers after a 2-year siege that had reduced Romans to cannibalism. The invasion was a catastrophe on a scale that we today can hardly fathom. Though the capital of the Western Roman Empire had by then been transferred to Ravenna, Rome was still the center of gravity of the whole Latin West, home to many senators and religious eminences and members of the nobility. Rome, as the eminent historian of late antiquity Peter Brown has written, quote, was the symbol of a whole civilization. It was as if an army had been allowed to sack Westminster Abbey or the Louvre, end quote. So the sense of psychological insecurity was somehow worse than the physical destruction. St. Jerome, the great biblical scholar and translator, spoke for the whole civilization when he wondered, if Rome can perish, what can be safe? Now, it could have been much worse. As it turned out, Alaric and his men for years had inhabited the peripheries of the Roman Empire. They weren't complete foreigners, nor they were utter heathens, but Christians of a sort, followers of a heretical sect that saw Jesus as a creation of God the Father. Pop quiz, professors accepted. What's the name of that heresy? Anyone? Yes, sir. Arian, that's right. Very good. For this reason, the barbarians spared at least some of the churches and those who took sanctuary inside them. Plus, as it would soon become clear, the barbarians were no more than ambitious blackmailers. They really just wanted a piece of the Roman power and wealth pie, and you can negotiate with people like that. Still, the sack of Rome was a sack, and the Visigoths inflicted on the Romans the full range of atrocities evoked by the words barbarian invasion, pillage, torture, rape, massacre. As if suffering these things weren't enough, the survivors who had escaped to Africa had to contend with a further indignity. They'd spent their whole lives in the Eternal City, amid the din of elevated Latin oratory wafting from the Forum, and then now found themselves in a relative backwater. Carthage, the capital of Roman Africa, was a lively, dynamic city, yet the area as a whole had lost much of its pagan splendor. The great amphitheaters had fallen into disrepair because of the recent turmoil. In other cases, remnants of the pagan past had been defaced, repurposed, or destroyed entirely because 3 generations had passed since the Constantinian conversion, and the religion of Jesus was now the official religion. The emperors regularly handed down diktats to suppress paganism and other rivals to the Christian faith. And the Africans The Roman Africans were men of a different sort than the refugees were accustomed to. They were beady-eyed, uncultured men, hardened farmers for the most part, even a few of them were fabulously wealthy. Many spoke a Punic dialect that must have grated the ears of men and women educated at Rome's great school of rhetoric. You couldn't even find a copy of Cicero's books in the Carthaginian bookshops, which I suppose the contemporary equivalent might be not being able to log on to Wi-Fi to check Instagram. And just beyond the olive groves that encircled the cities and towns lay a vast desert, its hot sands trodden by uncivilized nomads and their animals. What had happened? How had the Romans fallen so low? So for some conservative pagans among these refugees, the wellspring of their misery bore a Jewish name, Jesus. These men had never taken to the Christian religion. Now they gathered in salons to wax nostalgic about the polytheist past, with its dear old religion captured in Virgil's poetry, which taught them their glorious history and spelled out their true religious obligations. If only Rome had hewed to these older ways, things might have turned out differently. For clearly, this would-be Jewish king put to death by a Roman governor had failed to keep Rome safe. Therefore, a return to the gods of their ancestors was necessary. Who in Africa could answer these charges against the one God? As it happened, the region was home to one supremely influential Christian sage. He was a man deeply rooted in African soil, but who had earlier in life won entree to the most cultivated circles of Italian societies. He knew his way around the Bible, but also the works of Cicero, Varro, and other pagan sages. And he had climbed the summit of Latin oratory, the art the neo-pagans revered most highly. So this man, no surprise, was Augustine, the Catholic bishop of Hippo. By the time the refugees arrived, Augustine was nearly 60 years old and of ailing health, and putting down this neosurgent intellectual upsurge would form the magnum opus et arduum, the great and arduous work of his twilight years. So it's impossible to do justice to the life of the author of the Confessions. You must read it if you haven't. It is inarguably the greatest spiritual autobiography ever written, but I have to try to sketch an outline as briefly as I can. He was born in 354 in Thagist, a small town 175 miles from Carthage in present-day Algeria. His parents were poor. His father, Patrick if you want, was a hard man, a pagan given to strong drink who put all his hope in the education of his son, and that's because he knew that a classical education was the only passport to success for men of his class. His mother, Monica, was a fervent Christian, a woman of prayer and copious tears, who tirelessly beseeched the Almighty for the conversion of her abusive husband and that of her son, who would soon fall away from the faith. And Augustine would later address God in the Confessions about his mother, saying, "Within my mother's heart, you had already established your temple and laid the foundations of your dwelling place," end quote. His own heart and loins stirred with temptation. Few who read the Confessions will forget his account of joining a gang of kleptomaniac teens as they stole pears from some poor farmer. It wasn't the pears he wanted, he said. I had plenty of pears. No, I feasted only on the wickedness that was the fruit of my theft. Likewise, any former teen will recognize himself in the future saint who would take on a bad boy persona to impress his peers. When my actions were not enough to put me on a level with the hardened delinquents, I would pretend to have done things I have not. I've done that too. His father did little to restrain Augustine's wildness. So long as his son remained on the path to a remunerative career as an orator and lawyer, the old man was content. In this sense, the pagan patricius' indifference wouldn't be so out of place in our age. Only think of all the young meritocrats today whose parents don't bat an eyelid at any moral deformity, so long as junior checks the right resume boxes and masters the patois of the professional managerial class. In the event, Augustine did excel at his studies after graduating from the University at Carthage. He spent a decade as a teacher of rhetoric, first in Africa and later in Italy. Along the way, he took a concubine, sired a son, then prepared for and abandoned a legitimate marriage. His departure for Italy occasioned another one of those immortal scenes in the Confessions, that of Monica following me to the edge of the sea, holding on to me violently, so as either to call me back or to set out with me. To rid himself of her, Augustine would tell her that she could accompany him on the boat the following day, but as the story is well known, he would in fact depart in the middle of the night, and she stayed behind praying and weeping. But in fact, Monica wasn't done. She wasn't prepared to give up on her son. A year later, she would sail to Italy to win him back for God. So to another mother's natural fears for her son's physical well-being, Augustine added anxiety over the state of his soul. While still in Carthage, he had joined a cult known as the Manichees, a conversion that deeply offended Monica's Orthodox Christian sensibilities. It all began in college when he read the Hortensius, a book by Cicero, now largely lost to us. But we know little bits from it. One of them is this, that if the souls we have are eternal and divine, then we must conclude that the more we let them have their head in their natural activity, that is, in reasoning and the quest for knowledge, the easier it will be for them to ascend and return to heaven. For Cicero, as for many pagan sages, philosophy's aim was ultimately spiritual. It was to free the soul to soar to its own home, the realm of eternal wisdom. Wisdom was the way, and it was the end. As a student, Augustine thought he'd found such liberating wisdom in the teachings of the 3rd century Persian guru Mani. Manichaeism had spread from Mani's native land, which happens to be my native land as well, all the way to the Latin West, and all the way to China in the opposite direction. And it described the world starkly divided between two kingdoms, light and darkness. The kingdom of light was the domain of soul and noble truth. The kingdom of darkness was the realm of the fleshly and impure. Human souls were bound, quite against their will, to bodies that throbbed with impure desires and did disgusting things like fart and bleed and defecate. Light was trapped in darkness, and the whole universe was a battleground in the interminable war between the two equally matched kingdoms. Right? It's not that one or the other is stronger, it's that they're ever equally matched. This was how the Manichees explained the problem of evil. They radically externalized spiritual conflict. And if you knew this, as a Manichee expert, if you knew this, if you had this knowledge, this gnosis, it was enough to heal your soul. Practicing the religion, of course, involved all sorts of austerities, what you eat, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, a central feature of the faith was this elaborate avoidance of any sense of guilt. The total break between the two kingdoms meant the soul remained untainted by evil. Never mind that blaming the body while exculpating the soul in this way vitiated personal responsibility. But for Augustine, for a time, it gave him comfort. But he was restless, and he longed for answers to his burning questions, and his Manichee handlers would keep saying, "Wait, Faustus will come, and he'll answer all your questions." He was a Manichee divine renowned for his debating skills. When he addressed the Carthaginian throngs, his apparent brilliance at first wowed Augustine, and I praised and extolled him like the others and perhaps more, he wrote in the Confessions. But when he got to press the guy up close, he found an ill-read man out of his depth. It was one thing to be a clever debater, able to win over crowds with laugh lines and pseudo-profundities. It was quite another to possess true wisdom. The bigger problem was that Manichee wisdom didn't console Augustine. How could he overcome his propensity for acts that, while pleasurable for a moment, left his soul soul-sore? Why couldn't he stay away from the gladiatorial fights, even as he sensed that watching this brutality degraded his character somehow? So these problems gnawed at him, but even so, he stayed a Manichee for quite a long time. Even after he arrived in Italy, he briefly stayed with a member of the cult. But as his Manichee fervor was on the wane, Augustine began to dabble in philosophy once he crossed the Mediterranean. In Milan, he was appointed a professor of rhetoric and entered a serious intellectual milieu. This milieu consisted of two often overlapping circles. One was Christian, dominated by Ambrose, the Milanese bishop. Ambrose was the churchman whom Monica, Augustine's mother, would implore to convert her son once she followed him to Italy. The other circle belonged to the Neoplatonists. These were gentlemen scholars who promoted a revival of Plato's thought. Now, at the risk of grossly overgeneralizing, and I apologize to the professors in the room, Greco-Roman philosophy as a whole, we can say, tried to get at the unchanging principle behind all change. Why was it, the Neoplatonists asked specifically, that the soul falls and loses touch with its deepest activity, that is contemplation of wisdom? The answer was this, that a procession is the key word, of external appearances constantly distracted the soul. Each layer of illusion was further removed from the absolute immutable form of the world, from the capital O1, but remembering its former unfallen state, the soul constantly strove to return to the one. This Neoplatonic doctrine of procession, if you haven't heard of it, I gave you a relatively decent definition, though probably experts will watch it on YouTube and say, actually, but on the whole, I think it's right. This Neoplatonic doctrine of procession, as Brown notes, quote, brought pagan and Christian thinkers together within a single horizon of ideas. The end goal was the same, to return the soul to the unchangeable one. This was the highest good of human life. But a chasm, narrow but deep, divided the two sets of ideas. And that was the question of spiritual autonomy. The Neoplatonists thought that the individual could work out his own salvation by his own power alone. As he lay dying, for example, the key Neoplatonist philosopher Plotinus said, I am striving to give back the divine in myself to the divine in all. Salvation, then, was his effort, his striving. It involved his unaided rational assent, as Brown says, to wisdom. A Christian thinker like the Bishop Ambrose would have agreed that the soul was meant for reunion with the eternal and unchangeable. But he would put no stock by the saving power of one's own intellect or individual will. Self-salvation was impossible. Rather, salvation was to be found by God's grace and the grace-dispensing body that he had established on earth, namely the Catholic Church. Augustine tried the individualist route, but he finally couldn't will himself into purity and salvation. The force of habit was too strong. Even when he removed himself from the proximity of temptation, his memory still recalled the shape of a woman's curves, or the ecstasy of some long ago drunken revelry. Memory and habit tripped him up, so that he would cry out in agony in one of the most famous lines from the Confession, Lord, grant me chastity and continence, but please, not yet. That is, until his final conversion. In the year 386, Augustine, 31 years old, he has a nice job, he's financially secure, living in Milan with basically his buddies, living the philosophical life. I wish I could do that at 35. And late that summer, they received an African acquaintance, Ponticianus, who told them about the lives of the Egyptian monk Anthony of the Desert. Now, these desert monks were basically simple men. They were far less learned than someone like Augustine and his friends, but they had climbed stupendous mountains of chastity and self-denial. The more Augustine heard about their spiritual achievements, the more I loathed and execrated myself in comparison. He'd spent a whole decade since he had decided to seek wisdom, and what had he done with his soul? So agitated, Augustine retreated to the garden. He wept, he prayed, he cursed himself, and behold, suddenly I heard a voice from the house next door, the sound, as it might be, of a boy or a girl repeating in a sing-song voice a refrain unknown to me. Pick it up and read it. Pick it up and read it. He raced back to the sitting room, opened his copy of St. Paul's epistles at random, and read the first verse that caught his eye, quote, not in riotousness and drunkenness, not in lewdness and wantonness, not in strife and revelry, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh and its lusts. God had conquered the seeker. No sooner had I finished the sentence than it was as if the light of steadfast trust poured into my heart, and all the shadows of hesitation fled away. Augustine couldn't save himself. As a creature, he was a composite of flesh and soul. The higher, undying part of him sought communion with God, but the lower part, his corruptible flesh and his defective will, undermined the soul at every step. That much he knew before he flew to the garden. Then the Pauline words smacked him like a gush of hurricane wind. The only medium between God, the spiritual being, and a creature composed of spirit and flesh was faith, and faith specifically in the incarnate God, the God who became man. As he put it years later, this is from City of God, God's Son, assuming humanity without destroying his divinity, established and founded this faith that there might be a way for man to man's God through a God-man. For this is the mediator between God and men, the man Christ Jesus. Now the only way that is infallibly secured against all mistakes is when the very same person is at once God and man. God our end, man our way. So unlike what the Manichees thought, the point wasn't to go around flesh, but to go through flesh, to allow wisdom made flesh, to elevate corruptible flesh to the level of wisdom. Soon he would seek baptism in the church, he'd quit his job, he'd return to his African soil. And there he would enter the priesthood and would soon be appointed bishop of Hippo. And he would dedicate the rest of his life until his death in 430 to thinking for and with the church he now helped lead. As a bishop in Roman Africa, people brought him problems, big and small. Both average, ordinary people, but also eminences would bring him problem. And he just had to answer these letters and epistles and sermons. And as he was doing this, along the way, he laid the intellectual foundations for Christendom for a millennium to come. The overarching problem had to do with God and politics. Did government have a role in promoting faith? And did such faith work to the benefit or detriment of civil life? The immediate challenge arose, to bring us back to the beginning, from the neo-pagan conservatives. Before the rise of Christianity, kept saying, Rome had gathered great wealth and vast dominions, and their pagan forefathers were admirable men who had subdued their passions to their reason, and in the process built a magnificent commonwealth, a magnificent Republica. In mounting his defense against the neo-pagan onslaught, Augustine leveled a withering critique against the Roman past. By failing to honor the one God, he countered, Romans had failed to realize their own vision of the Republic. His arguments are as pertinent to our time as they were to the 5th century. That's a bold claim, but let me try. Neither Augustine nor his pagan interlocutors, as we've said, sharply divided faith from political life. Beginning with the Greek city-states, quote, the worship of the gods was deeply interwoven with social and political life. As the theologian Edmund Wildstein tells us, each city had its patron deities who bound citizens to each other and to the political order. Important rites were carried out by the ruler themselves to make sure that the city was safe and secure. And thus, quote, patriotism was piety and excommunication. And this didn't change when myth gave way to philosophy. To the classical philosophers, too, belief and worship were central to political community. To Plato, and especially his student Aristotle, it was clear that politics ordered all other human activities. Hence, the aim of all politics wasn't to protect maximal individual autonomy, but to discern and promote the common good of the whole community. Common goods, this is a useful definition, are those that only the community can secure, and they aren't diminished by being shared. Peace and justice, for example, only increase the more people partake of them. Now, what rulers believe about the final end or ultimate purpose of human life necessarily shapes their view of the common good. If they believe that the ultimate end of life is for everyone to hoard as much wealth as they can, not too unfamiliar, I think, to our age, then they will order politics in a certain way. But if they believe the point is to grow in virtue, that's not Corona, not least charity, I am ready, they will order politics differently. Therefore, for Aristotle, as much for classical philosophy, the end of life was a public matter, and religion had to be fully integrated into politics. And Roman thought more or less adopted these ideas. As you probably know, the Latin word religio, the root of the English word religion, meant reverence not only towards the gods, but also toward human superiors. Therefore, religion was necessary for the maintenance and expansion of the Republic, which the Romans believed, or the Commonwealth, I should say, which the Romans believed they had been charged by destiny to bring to every rational being. Cicero, the same author who had set off the teenage Augustine on his quest for wisdom, had defined the Commonwealth as simply the property of a people. But a people is not any collection of human beings thrown together any sort of way. Rather, a true people is an assemblage of individuals associated with respect to two things, justice and a partnership for the common good. To repeat, a true people shared an account of justice, of what is right and what is due to each person, and pursued the common good of all. Were the pagan Romans a people by the crisp definition of their own master statesman and orator? Were Roman politics true politics? Were their civil life true civil life? Augustine didn't think so. And to rebuke his compatriots' pride, he would recast the entirety of human history as the tale of two cities, the earthly city and the city of God. This was his great and arduous work. This was the city of God. The glorious city of God is my theme in this work, he began. A city surpassingly glorious. The city of God is the community of believers living by faith in this fleeting course of time, traveling as a stranger in the midst of the ungodly. The earthly city, meanwhile, is home to those who prefer their own gods to the founder of the city of God, that is God. It is any earthly city whose foundation is the love of self, even to the point of contempt for God. Rome was the earthly city par excellence in his time, and part of Augustine's task was to prove that it had been just as violent, if not more so, before the legalization of Christianity and its eventual adoption as the official religion. This was easy work because Augustine knew Roman history like he did the wrinkles on his own face. The pre-Christian era, he showed, was no golden age of peace, the new pagan's sweet nostalgia notwithstanding. Rather, it was disfigured by horrendous violence, beginning with the very founding of the city, at which Romulus murdered his twin Remus. But Augustine's deeper project was to show that the Roman Commonwealth didn't add up to a true Commonwealth, because its inhabitants didn't, in fact, share a full and sound account of justice. Remember, that's one of the two requirements set out by Cicero, the excellent Roman, of what a true Commonwealth will possess. If justice meant giving each his due, as classical philosophy had always defined it, then pagan Rome fell short of it. Its laws, after all, failed to encourage and even impeded the fundamental human desire to know and love God. The impulse that the Neoplatonists had identified at the level of the individual soul, the longing to return to the one unchanging and unchangeable principle of the cosmos, the absolute behind all shifting ephemera, was blocked at the collective level. Simply put, Rome didn't give God his due, and therefore its justice wasn't true justice. As Augustine put it in a crucial passage in the City of God, I will take a deep breath, where there is not this righteousness whereby the one supreme God rules the obedient city according to his grace, so that it sacrifices to none but him, and whereby in all the citizens of this obedient city the soul consequently rules the body and reason the vices in the rightful order, so that as the individual just man, so also the community and the people of the just live by faith, which works by love, that love whereby man loves God as he ought to be loved and his neighbor as himself. There, I say, there is not an assemblage associated by a common acknowledgement of right and a community of interest. Remember, that's the Ciceronian definition of a true commonwealth. But if there is not this, there is not a people, if our definition be true, and therefore there is no republic, no true commonwealth. For where there is no people, there can be no republic. Now, elsewhere in the book, Augustine did seem to offer a more minimal definition of peoplehood as an assemblage of reasonable beings bound together by a common agreement as to the objects of their love. The higher the objects of love, he suggested, the more superior the people and therefore the more superior the commonwealth. Nevertheless, in the same passage, Augustine was quick to re-emphasize that a city that doesn't give God his due is, quote, void of true justice. It is notable, too, that Augustine devoted much of his book to showing that Rome wasn't a commonwealth under the first, more robust Ciceronian definition. At most, Augustine granted, the Romans had grasped the shadows of the real thing, much like the helpless Neoplatonic soul caught glimpses of the full truth in the procession of ephemera that passed before it. But still, a shadow is a shadow, no matter how clear or sharp its contours. Romans told themselves comforting stories about how they were spreading the rule of law to the ends of the earth, but Augustine exposed the amor laudis, the love of praise, and the libido dominandi, the lust for domination that lurked behind these lofty pretensions. And he laid the blame for this state of affairs at the feet of the gods who bestrode the pagan spiritual landscape. These gods were more akin to demons. They were lustful and capricious, irrational and chaotic. Anyone who's read any Homer will recognize what Augustine's talking about there. Hadn't the same revered Cicero, for example, condemned the Greco-Roman gods, quote, debased to the likeness of human weakness? Hadn't he poured scorn on, quote, who are even introduced as having perturbed minds. They were crazy. Hadn't he denounced the shameful Homeric accounts of the lusts and cares and angers of the gods? What kind of deities fought wars between themselves or started wars between their human subjects? In Augustine's telling, the capriciousness and cruelty of these gods reflected not divinity, but the lusts and confusions of their adherents. The perversity was in turn mirrored in the various rites to these gods, who demanded propitiation, quote, with stupid and monstrous idol, with human victims, with putting a wreath on a male organ, with the wages of unchastity, with the cutting of limbs, with emasculation, with the consecration of effeminates, with impure and obscene plays. Given whom the Romans worshipped, it is no wonder that Roman politics exploded with periodic bouts of fratricide. Promise, I'm almost done. Nor is it hard to see why the Romans lusted after domination of other nations, even if they draped this lust in rule of law rhetoric. At a more quotidian level, Augustine the African had seen the shortcomings of pagan peoplehood and later tried to correct them as a Christian bishop. Take almsgiving. Wealthy Romans liked to throw massive, decadent feasts at pagan holidays, their idea of redistributive justice. But to Augustine's mind, the feast-giving amounted to a pseudo-virtue rather than true charity, for the real purpose was to cement ties of mutual obligation among friends, clients, and allies, as Brown explains. You threw big parties to show off to other local bigs, not to help the poor as a moral obligation in itself. For Augustine, true almsgiving had to be anonymous and indiscriminate, quote, a judicious transfer of wealth from this unsafe world, says Brown, to the next. There were other evils, the rites offered by some farmers to pagan demons in the hope that food shortages might drive up prices, the miserable state of the serf-like tenant laborers, which only deteriorated once they achieved a measure of independence from their lords, and now the lords were freed from any obligation to actually care for the people who used to be in their charge, the overtaxation of crop yields by the administration in Rome for the consumption of imperial troops, and on and on. There was a kind of virtue at work in these cases, industriousness, martial hardness, and so on. But as Waldstein puts it, Rome's civic life was turned into a mockery by the fundamental injustice of not giving God his due at the level of the political community. By failing to order society to the true highest good of human life, well-being in the next world, communion with the source of all goodness, the Romans had deformed even their virtues into vices. High and important as they are, even virtues bloat with pride without reference to the highest thing, the highest being, God. As a Manichae and later a Platonist hesitating at the church's door, Augustine had struggled to rightly relate his body to his soul without God's help. Likewise, quote, Roman imperialists had claimed that Rome's rule of her subjects was just because it was advantageous to them, like the rule of soul over the body. But if the souls of Romans did not serve God, then there was no legitimacy to the rule of their souls over their bodies or of their city over other cities, end quote. But how, the neo-pagans shot back, how? Are we going to hand our government to you people who are obsessed with the world to come instead of this world? Against this charge, Augustine proposed the godly servant ruler. His or her outstanding feature, per Augustine, is, quote, true piety, the only source of true virtue. Quote, there could be nothing more fortunate for human affairs than that, by the mercy of God, they who are endowed with true piety of life, if they have the skill of ruling people, should also have the power, end quote. Such rulers necessarily take a religious view of governance. What does that mean? Well, they're slow to punish and ready to pardon, because they believe in penance and redemption. When they do punish, they do so in defense of the republic and not in order to gratify their own enmity. If circumstances do call for severity, servant rulers leaven it with mercy and the liberality of benevolence. Their luxury is restrained. Donald Trump, take note. Their actions motivated by love of eternal felicity rather than the ardent desire of empty glory. In short, servant rulers acknowledge the superiority or the primacy of the spiritual, and for this very reason they rule more humanely. Why? Because if you're afraid of something higher than you as a ruler, you might act differently toward weaker people. What might that look like in practice? Well, by the time Augustine wrote City of God, Roman history had already given the world an image of such a ruler. The Christian emperor Theodosius in 390 AD had had certain rioters summarily and brutally executed. In response, so outraged was the Bishop Ambrose at this massacre that he ordered him to perform penance on pain of excommunication from the Catholic Church. This is one of the famous episodes of late Roman history, and Theodosius complied. This was a political and religious earthquake whose magnitude is impossible to overstate. This man's pagan predecessors had wielded power quite literally as God emperors. If you were a good Roman citizen, you worshipped quite literally the God emperor. But now this emperor himself was acknowledging his sins and begging the forgiveness of a quite different God and his earthly apostle. The episode, Waldstein writes, remains centuries later, quote, an inspiring example of the primacy of the spiritual. By binding the political community to a higher power, the highest, in fact, Christian politics tamed power. The human dignity that men and women like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks had to strive for as a matter of rights under a liberal regime resided in this vision at the very root of power. This is the form of benevolent government, Augustine suggested, that would have existed even if sin hadn't corrupted flesh and rendered the will defective. It is natural earthly government ordered to the city of God, where, Augustine wrote, even those who give commands are at the service of those whom they appear to command. For they do not give their commands out of a desire for domination, but rather out of dutiful concern for others, not out of any pride in ruling, but rather out of compassion for others. This is what the order of nature prescribes. This is the way God created man. Now, we began by asking, does God need politics? God doesn't need anything. He is God. But the God of the Bible seeks to transfigure everything about us, including our cities. He wants to help our political nature find healing, in Waldstein's apt phrase. That might sound like a big, scary claim to ears marinated in liberal assumptions about the purpose of politics. Then again, liberalism itself, and I don't mean by liberalism the left here, then again, liberalism itself came as a shock when it claimed to totally sever politics from the shared quest for the highest goods of human life. It's liberalism that's new. It's liberalism that's only about 300 years old and has to prove itself. Today, the very words highest good evoke the specter of bloody religious wars and persecutions. In the liberal frame, any attempt to politically discern, much less achieve the highest good of human life, is bound to yield intolerable coercion. For right-wing or classical liberals, even the common good, let alone the highest good, is a synonym for status oppression. The most we can hope for in our common life in this view is to just protect our basic shared interests, such as security and contract enforcement, while allowing each individual citizen to pursue those goods she deems highest. For most of us, that means wealth, career success, tech superiority, and the like. But these are private and competitive goods. Remember the difference between a private good and a common good. As such, they give rise to plenty of coercion. Only much of the coercion we suffer is meted out by private actors. Is the employer who digitally monitors every second of his workers' time in a punitive way, not coercing them? Doesn't a large, sophisticated corporation act coercively when it enforces, a 50% interest rate against a high school educated single mother? What about the 11-year-old who encounters hardcore pornography online and develops a lifelong addiction to ever more extreme and exploitative imagery? Isn't he coerced by his own defective will and the ready availability of prurient content? Liberal societies do coerce then. More than that, they enshrine a vision of the highest good, all their secular pretensions notwithstanding. After all, the very notion that we can't know, much less legislate, humanity's highest end is itself a metaphysical, even a spiritual claim, and it stands at the heart of the modern project. Its God is the unbound self, and the worship of such a God will inevitably have political consequences. Vast accumulations of capital, much of it concentrated in a very few hands, a ceaselessly disruptive culture colored by kaleidoscopic lifestyles, a heavily armed commercial empire. But is all that enough for a truly just political community, a true commonwealth? That's the problem fueling popular discontent across much of the developed world in our century. And accounting for the accidental changes, it would have been squarely familiar to Augustine. What would the Bishop of Hippo make of our situation? He would certainly find in the modern West an assemblage of reasonable beings bound together by a common agreement as to the objects of their love, namely the love of unbound personal liberty and of wealth. Perhaps such loves can sustain the empire yet, for a while yet, in God's good providence. But so long as our hearts stir restless for something higher, the city of God will beckon them to find rest in its geography of love. Sancta Augustina, ora pro nobis. Thank you very much.